My husband drove to the post office every Saturday morning for 27 years. 8 o'clock sharp, without fail. Rain, snow, the kind of bitter February cold that makes your bones ache. Gerald never missed it. When I asked him why, he'd button his coat and say the same thing every time. Just taking care of a few things, Carol. You know how I am about staying organized. And I did know. Gerald was a chartered accountant for 31 years at a firm in downtown Halifax. Precision was his love language, so I never questioned the Saturday drives. Why would I? He always came home by 10, smelling of Tim Hortons coffee and cold air, ready to rake the leaves or fix the eavesdrows or do whatever quiet, responsible thing needed doing around the house. That was Gerald. Steady. Reliable. The kind of man you built a life on. The morning he died, I was in the backyard planting tulip bulbs for spring. Our daughter Melissa called from her car. Her voice was strange, flat, like she was reading from a script she hadn't had time to rehearse. Mum, Dad collapsed at the golf course. You need to come to the hospital. By the time I got there, still with dirt under my fingernails, Gerald was already gone. A massive stroke. The doctor said he likely felt nothing, that it was quick. I stood in that hallway in my gardening clothes and nodded like I understood. Like any of it made sense. At the funeral, people kept telling me how lucky I was. 41 years of marriage to a good man. Our home in Cole Harbor paid off. 2 children who'd turned out well. Gerald had always handled the finances, but he'd been careful. Responsible, everyone said so. His colleagues from the firm came in their good suits and told me he'd been one of the best. I smiled and thanked them, and felt something I couldn't quite name sitting beneath all of it. Not grief exactly, something stranger. A stillness, like the moment just before a door opens. 11 days after the funeral, a letter arrived from Canada Post. Not a bill, not a condolence card. A formal notice addressed to me, Margaret Carol Whitfield, informing me that I was listed as the secondary key holder on a post office box registered to Gerald Raymond Whitfield at the Dartmouth North Outlet. The box rental had been prepaid through March. I was invited to contact them at my convenience to arrange access or renewal. I read it 3 times at the kitchen table with my tea going cold beside me. A post office box. In 27 years of those Saturday morning drives, Gerald had never once mentioned a post office box. I called our son Paul that evening. He's practical like his father, works in project management in Ottawa, always the one who stays calm when things fall apart. I read him the letter over the phone. The silence that followed was a few seconds too long. "Mum," he said carefully, "I've been going through Dad's files. I was going to call you this week. There are some things I can't make sense of." I asked him what kind of things. He said he'd drive down on the weekend. I spent 2 days moving through our house like a woman searching for something she didn't know she'd lost. Gerald's office, which I'd barely entered in 40 years of marriage because he'd always been so particular about it, suddenly felt like unfamiliar territory. His filing cabinet was organized in that precise way of his, labeled tabs in alphabetical order, everything in its place. I opened drawers I'd never opened. I found nothing alarming, but I found nothing reassuring either. Paul arrived Saturday. He had Gerald's quiet manner about him, but his eyes gave him away. He sat at the dining room table and spread out a folder of documents. He'd been thorough. He always was. "Mum, did you know Dad had a second investment account, separate from the joint RRSP?" I told him we had one RRSP, the one we'd both contributed to for years. Paul shook his head. He placed a statement in front of me. The account was in Gerald's name only. The balance was $412. Our joint account, the one I'd always believed held our retirement savings, showed a balance of just under $900. The room shifted slightly. That couldn't be right. Paul looked at me with the expression of someone who has already grieved something and is now helping another person begin. "Mom, I can't find the pension funds. I can't find the RRSPs. I've found 3 accounts, all in Dad's name only. and they're all either empty or nearly so. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Gerald and I had shared for 4 decades and stared at the ceiling and thought about every Saturday morning for 27 years. I drove to the Dartmouth North Post Office the following Tuesday. I brought the letter, my identification, and a copy of Gerald's death certificate. The woman at the counter was kind, efficient. She confirmed the box was registered to my husband, that I was listed as secondary holder, and that I could access it immediately. She gave me the key. Box 214 was at the end of a row, second from the bottom. Small, gray, unremarkable. I crouched down and opened it with hands that were steadier than I expected. Inside was a bundle of envelopes held together with an elastic band, a small notebook with a green cover, and a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Gerald's handwriting. I carried everything to my car and sat in the parking lot for a long time before I opened anything. The envelopes came first. They were bank statements and correspondence, going back nearly 6 years. Letters from financial institutions I didn't recognize. Statements showing withdrawals, transfers, account closures. The amounts were staggering. Over the course of 5 years, Gerald had moved or lost, it wasn't clear yet, which approximately $380,000 from accounts I'd believed were our joint retirement savings. Some had gone into investments, risky ones, a mining company in northern Ontario, a real estate development in Kelowna that had collapsed, a private equity fund that no longer existed. Every one of them a loss. The notebook was worse. It was Gerald's handwriting, dates and numbers going back to 2018. It was a record of his attempts to fix things, columns of figures showing what he'd lost and what he'd tried to recover, each attempt making the hole deeper. The last entry was dated 4 months before he died. The number at the bottom of the page, underlined twice, was a negative I couldn't stop staring at. Then I opened the envelope with my name on it. Carol, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found the box. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, and I know that. 6 years ago, I made a decision I was certain was right. I'd read about an investment opportunity through a colleague, and I was convinced it would set us up for life. Let you retire earlier, take the trips we always talked about. It didn't work. I lost a significant amount, and instead of telling you, I tried to recover it. I kept thinking I was close, that one more quarter would turn it around. It never did. I took money from our RRSPs to cover shortfalls. I told myself I'd replace it. I never could. By the time you read this, our retirement savings are largely gone. The equity line on the house is maxed out. I did this, not you. You trusted me completely, and I used that trust to protect you from something I was too ashamed to admit. I thought I was shielding you. I know now I was only shielding myself. I'm sorry, Carol. I love you. That was never a lie. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes and did not cry. The grief I felt wasn't the sharp kind. It was wide and slow, like water rising around something you can't move. When I got home, Paul's car was in the driveway. He was sitting on the front step with 2 coffees from the shop down the street, waiting. I handed him the bundle from the post office without a word and watched him read. His face went through several things it had probably never done before. When he finished, he looked up at me. Mom, there's something else I have to tell you. I told him to go ahead. A few years ago, his father had approached him about an investment, a development project in New Brunswick. Promising returns, low risk, Gerald's words. Paul had seriously considered it. He'd had savings set aside for the children's RESP. Gerald had wanted him to put it all in. What stopped you? I asked. His wife, Jennifer. She'd asked to see the prospectus, and when Gerald couldn't produce one, she'd said no, firmly. Paul had been frustrated with her at the time. He wasn't frustrated with her anymore. I found a lawyer through a colleague of Paul's. Her name was Sandra Park, and her office was in a small building near the waterfront in Halifax. tidy and direct like she was. She listened to everything. The post office box, the notebook, Gerald's letter, the statements. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me without softening what she was about to say, which I appreciated. Mrs. Whitfield, what you're describing is a pattern of financial concealment that affected your jointly held assets and your retirement security. The equity line on the house, were you aware of it? I was not. Then your signature on those documents needs to be verified, because if you didn't sign them, that's fraud, even when committed by a spouse. She let the words settle. He's gone, I said. What can actually be done? She told me. We could work with the bank to challenge the equity line. We could contact the Canada Revenue Agency regarding the RRSP withdrawals and whether proper processes were followed. We could potentially recover some of what was lost through estate claims. It's going to take time, she said. Months, possibly longer. And it's going to require you to be very organized and very patient. I told her those were things I could manage. Melissa called that evening. My daughter lived in Vancouver and had always been closer to her father. She had his patience, his quietness, the way he could make a room feel settled just by being in it. When I told her what I'd found, she went so still on the phone that I thought the call had dropped. Then, "Mum, are you sure you're reading this right?" Dad was meticulous. He would never have his letter, I told her. He admitted it in his own handwriting. Another silence. Maybe there's context we don't have. Maybe he had a plan we don't know about. I told her gently that I'd hired a lawyer and that Paul was helping me go through the documents. She said she needed some time. She hung up before I could say I understood. Paul called me an hour later. Melissa had phoned him, upset, insisting I was in shock, that grief was distorting things. He told her the documents were real. She'd stopped speaking to him after that. The next several weeks were the hardest kind of work. Sandra filed a request with the bank to review the home equity documents. A handwriting analyst confirmed what I already knew: my signature on the equity application was not mine. 2 financial institutions, when presented with the documentation, agreed to open investigations. Gerald's letter helped more than anything. A man admitting his own wrongdoing in his own words is difficult to argue against, even after he's gone. Paul came to Halifax every other weekend. We sat at the dining room table with stacks of paper and worked through it together. One evening, he looked across at me and said, "Mum, you're handling this better than I am." I told him I wasn't handling it better. I was just further along in accepting that the man I loved was also a man who made terrible choices and couldn't bring himself to tell me. Both things were true. They had to be. I was 63 years old, and I needed to go back to work. I'd retired 2 years earlier from a 20-year position as an administrator at the IWK Health Center. I hadn't imagined needing to unretire. But the savings were gone. The retirement income I'd planned on was gone, and the equity line on the house meant there was a debt attached to the only asset I had left. I called a former colleague. Within 2 weeks, I had a part-time administrative role, 3 days a week. It wasn't what I'd imagined for this season of my life, but it was mine. On one of those early mornings back at work, a woman I'd known slightly for years sat across from me in the break room. She looked tired in a way that went past sleep. I asked how she was doing, and she said she was fine. And then she said, "Actually, no, she wasn't." And then she told me her husband had been making financial decisions she hadn't been part of, and she'd just found out the extent of it. I listened. I told her what I'd been through. I gave her Sandra's name. She cried a little, and then straightened up in the way people do when they've been carrying something alone for too long, and someone finally helped them set it down. It happened again a few weeks later. And then again. I hadn't sought it out. It simply found me, the way certain things do when you've been through something specific and visible. 4 months after Gerald died, the bank concluded their investigation. The equity line documents had been fraudulently signed. The lien on my home was released. Sandra called me with the news, and I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and let myself breathe for the first time since October. It wasn't everything. The retirement savings were still largely gone. The investment losses couldn't be recovered. But the house was mine. Clean and clear and mine. Melissa still wasn't speaking to me. She'd sent one email saying she was grieving and needed distance, and couldn't engage with what felt to her like an attack on her father's memory. I wrote back and told her I understood, that I loved her, that the door was always open. I didn't send a second email. I'd learned something about the people who need the version of a person they knew to stay intact. You can't argue them into a different understanding. They have to arrive there themselves. Then one evening in late February, my phone rang. It was Melissa. Her voice was different from the last time, stripped of something. She'd been going through her own financial records, she said. She and her partner had been planning to buy a property, and the bank had pulled her credit report. There was a line of credit on it she'd never opened. In her name. 5 years old. Used and partially paid down and used again. The address associated with it was our house in Cole Harbor. She'd called the institution. She'd provided identification. She'd gotten the application documents. Her father's handwriting was on the form. Her signature was not. I listened to her cry for a long time. I didn't say I told you so. That's not a thing you say to your child in a moment like that. I said, I'm so sorry, Melissa. I'm so sorry this happened to you too. She asked if she could come home. I told her to come whenever she was ready. She flew in the following weekend. The three of us, Paul, Melissa, and I, sat in the living room of the house where they'd grown up and went through the documents together. Not the way people go through documents when they're building a case, but the way people go through difficult things when they've decided to stop going through them alone. Melissa kept stopping and looking at photographs on the shelf, the ones of Gerald at the children's graduations, at her wedding, coaching Paul's hockey team in 1998. He was still Dad, Paul said quietly. That's the hard part. Melissa nodded. I told them what I'd come to believe, that a person can be genuinely loving and genuinely flawed to a degree that causes harm, that those two things aren't opposites, that understanding it doesn't mean excusing it, that we were allowed to grieve the father he'd been and reckon with what he'd done at the same time. Sandra helped Melissa file the same fraud documentation I had. The line of credit was eventually removed from her report. I kept going back to the post office that spring, not to box 214 I'd surrendered the key, but to the same building, the same parking lot where I'd sat on that cold Tuesday, and opened a bundle of envelopes that changed everything. I don't know exactly why I kept passing it. Habit, maybe. Or the particular way grief makes you return to the places where things shifted, as if standing there long enough might explain it. At work, the woman from the break room had started talking to others. By March, there were 4 of us who gathered occasionally in the small meeting room at lunch, just to talk, to compare notes on lawyers and credit bureaus, and the strange loneliness of being betrayed by someone you'd loved thoroughly. By May, there were 9. We weren't a support group exactly, not formally, just a circle of women who had arrived at the same difficult place by different roads and found it less frightening with company. I shared my story at one of those lunches, all of it, the Saturday drives, the post office box, the notebook with the columns of numbers, the letter, the daughter who hadn't believed me at first, the house I'd almost lost, the retirement I was having to rebuild at 63. When I finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. Then one woman said, I feel less crazy than I did this morning. Several others nodded. That's the thing no one tells you about financial abuse in a marriage. And Sandra was clear that what Gerald had done, whatever his intentions, met the legal definition. It doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like a husband who loves you, who wants to protect you from worry, who tells you not to bother with the boring money stuff because he's got it covered. The control is so gentle, so dressed up in care, that you don't recognize it until you're standing in a parking lot with evidence in your hands. A year after Gerald died, I opened a new account. Not at the bank we'd always used together, but at a credit union on Gottingen Street, one I'd chosen myself. I deposited my first full month's salary from the part-time job. It wasn't a large amount, but every dollar in it was mine, accounted for, visible. I knew exactly where it had come from and exactly where it was going. I requested a copy of my own credit report for the first time in my adult life, and I read it carefully. I started attending a financial literacy workshop at the public library, the kind of thing I would have smiled politely and declined 10 years ago because Gerald had it handled. I sat in those plastic chairs with women 30 years younger than me and took notes and asked questions and did not feel embarrassed about either. On what would have been our 42nd anniversary, I drove past the Dartmouth North Post Office on my way to Paul's house for dinner. I didn't stop. I didn't need to anymore. I kept driving, and I thought about Gerald, about the man who'd driven this same route every Saturday for 27 years, holding a secret he'd thought was protecting me, and about the woman I'd been who'd let him, who'd believed that trust and delegation were the same thing. They aren't the same thing. That's what I know now. If any of this feels familiar to you, the husband who handles everything, the finances you've never quite had access to, the small, uneasy feeling you keep brushing aside, I want to say this clearly. That feeling is information. It is not paranoia. It is not ingratitude. It is not a failure of love. Ask questions. Read the statements. Put your name on the accounts. Know the numbers, not because you expect betrayal, but because your financial life is yours, and no one who genuinely loves you should want to keep you in the dark about it. I'm not the woman who planted tulip bulbs that October morning, expecting her husband to come home from the golf course. I'm someone different now, I won't say stronger, because that makes it sound like the loss was worth it, and I don't believe that. But I'm clearer. I see the ground beneath my feet because I finally checked that it was there. And if you're reading this because your own ground gave way, I want you to know you can find solid footing again. It takes time and paperwork and more difficult conversations than you ever wanted to have. But it's possible. I know because I'm standing on it.